A young teenage boy is practicing his fighting skills. He looses arrow after arrow, hitting the target with precise accuracy. He has a number of servants around him, but still this young teenage boy feels completely lonely. As an aristocrat, he is in a castle that is supposed to be his own, which should mean he should feel free to do as he pleases. But this is no ordinary teenage boy. He longs for his parents, but he understands that they are off in the capital city doing what they need to do. He is under the ward of a distant cousin, known to him as Lord Warwick, a man who has a very distant link to the throne of England. The young teenage boy, Edward, looks up to his distant cousin, the Earl of Warwick. He has taught him the art of war and the virtues of chivalric behavior. Edward admires the Earl of Warwick, even more so today because he has just inherited great swaths of land and has been elevated to one of the most important and powerful peers in the country. A fact that Edward will use to his advantage in the future, because this young teenage boy will one day be Edward the Fourth, the King of England, and the Earl of Warwick will be his most important advisor, and in time, his biggest enemy. Hello and welcome to the channel. I'm of course the Knight of History, and this is part number 3 of the War of the Roses story, a story that has bloodshed everywhere and family rivalry. If you haven't watched part number 1 and part number 2 yet, I suggest you go watch those first, of course. Then more importantly, if you're feeling charitable, please find the link below in the description to donate to a charity called Mercy Ships, hospitals and ships that help people out who have nothing. So any donation will help out, I promise you that. I've also decided to run the Milan Marathon, which I'm currently doing a video on at the time, in an attempt to create this fundraising giving idea of charity. So please, if you can, give. And also, of course, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Now, let's get into this. After the fact that Edward IV had sent his cousin Henry VI and his wife Queen Margaret packing into their exile in Scotland and then France post-Battle of Taunton 1461, the widely popular and charming Edward IV became the undisputed King of England. But his reign really depended on his supporters, chief of which was of course his distant cousin, the very powerful and rich man who raised Edward, the Earl of Warwick. Warwick groomed Edward to become king from an early age, and in reality, Warwick was the true power behind the English throne at that time. There was even a French envoy who came to England, and he stated that England has 2 kings, Warwick and another one whose name I've entirely forgotten. Edward IV saw that Warwick was perhaps gaining too much power over him and wanted to break free from his control, but at the same time, Edward was romantic. 3 years after being called the undisputed King of England in 1464, Edward IV married his true love, a commoner, named Elizabeth Woodville. He married her far below his station in life. Normally, kings married princesses from other royal families as a political treaty or to aid their alliances. So when Edward IV did this, of course the Earl of Warwick, when he found out, was absolutely furious, especially because he had organized a marriage contract between Edward and Bona di Savoia, the very wealthy daughter of Ludovico, the Duke of Savoy, who had French connections, and amazingly he was the owner of the Shroud of Turin, the cloth that Jesus was meant to be wrapped in after his crucifixion. This caused a rift between the two. Edward tried to push Warwick out of power even more so and become a true medieval autocratic monarch. The Earl of Warwick accused Elizabeth, Edward's new wife, and her mother, Jacqueline of Luxembourg, of witchcraft to try and restore the power that he had lost, but to no avail. Still, however, in 1465, Edward was looked at as if he was the autocratic monarch, but he still liked the Earl of Warwick. He liked him as a person. So when Henry VI was eventually found and captured in Scotland, it was actually the Earl of Warwick who took the ex-king down to Edward and locked him up in the Tower. Nonetheless, Warwick's power at court waned, until it was pretty much replaced by Edward's wife's father, Richard Woodville, the Earl of Rivers, in 1466. In the autumn of 1467, there were rumours that Warwick was now sympathetic to the Lancastrian cause, which is of course against Edward, who was the leader of the Yorkists. But even though he refused to come to court and answer for these charges, the king, Edward IV, head of the Yorkists, accepted Warwick's denial of these claims in writing. In July 1468, it was revealed that Warwick's deputy in Calais, France, was involved with the Lancastrian conspiracy, and in early 1469, another Lancastrian plot was uncovered, and it was clear that people weren't entirely happy with Edward IV's reign, a fact that Warwick could exploit. The fact is that Queen Margaret of the Lancastrian forces had been trying to muster up troops in exile in France to sit her husband, the mentally ill Henry VI, back on the throne of England once again, so that their son Edward, the Prince of Wales, may rule in the future. By 1469, things were really clear. Warwick had actually changed sides. He left his old king behind, Edward IV, and joined the Lancastrians in France. This is where we see literally brothers fighting against brothers, as Edward IV's younger brother, George Plantagenet, the Duke of Clarence, left his brother, the king's court, and was persuaded by Warwick to join him in exile in France. When they arrived there, George, this 19-year-old prince, and Isabel, Warwick's daughter, were married, unifying their bond together. This situation was really deadly because it was a Game of Thrones, and making the wrong choice could get you killed. So, to do this by changing sides was extraordinarily dangerous. Kind of reminds me of a current prince of the UK. The pair of them, George and Warwick, sailed to Kent with a large force and met up with a bunch of other rebels in England in the northern countryside, and charged on to meet the bulk of their force near Northamptonshire. Edward IV, of course, caught wind that there was a rebel force in his kingdom, and he marched out to demolish them. I mean, who were they to contest his rule? Well, it didn't completely go well for Edward at the Battle of Edgecote on the 24th of July, 1469. The outcome was that the king's men had been beaten, and Edward IV himself had been outmaneuvered. He was taken prisoner and forced into Middleham Castle, so England was now kingless. In the long run, however, it proved impossible to rule without a king in England, and this continuing disorder forced Warwick to release King Edward IV in September 1469, which of course forced Warwick out of the country. He had to flee away from the king that he had just released, and he fled to France and reconciled with Queen Margaret in France, the leader of the Lancastrian forces, who was at the court of the French king Louis XI. Edward IV's brother, George, who had fought with Warwick, decided to change sides again and join up with his brother's army in the Yorkist forces. Warwick managed to gather up some French troops and set out for another invasion in England. At the same time, though, Warwick's brother, a person called Montague, who lived in the north of England, decided to gather up a whole bunch of troops himself. Warwick landed in the south of England with a whole bunch of French troops that he had mustered up, and he caught Edward IV's attention by going and looting a bunch of villages. Of course, Edward hurried down to the south of England. He's going to go meet Warwick in the battlefield. But Warwick's brother, Montague, had this bunch of forces that came down from the north, and the king found himself surrounded from the south and the north. This is where he made a life-changing decision. He ran. On October the 2nd, 1470, the king, Edward IV, ran away from his country to Flanders in modern-day Belgium. Warwick had won. He placed the original king, Henry VI, on the throne as a figurehead, because we all know, of course, Warwick was the real leader, not Henry. This, however, was not going to last very long, as Edward IV went to the French king, Louis XI, who liked this idea of having a weak England, especially after the 100 Years' War. So Louis XI gave Edward IV the troops he needed to take back his throne in England, which amazingly he did in great splendour at the Battle of Barnet in 1471. Warwick was killed in this battle, along with his brother Montague. Henry VI, the actual king, was then imprisoned and most likely murdered by Edward's soldiers. So this is the end, right? It's all over. Well, even though Edward's brother, George, the Duke of Clarence, who changed sides multiple times, eventually ended up on the right side, he was tried and killed for treason for his actions in 1478, apparently drowned in wine. England was at peace. The War of the Roses was done. Edward IV ruled his country, and all was well. That was until he died in 1483 after catching a cold whilst fishing at the age of 40. His death, though, would kickstart the war once again in potentially the most horrific act of the age. Find out what happens next when we speak about the princes in the Tower. I really hope that you enjoyed that. Please don't forget to donate to the charity. Find the link down below. Like, comment, and subscribe. The more you know.